tych krótkich technicznych informacjach. Na debacie poświęconej polityce Unii Europejskiej wobec Rosji, organizowanej przez warszawskie biuro European Council on Foreign Relations, które to biuro mam przyjemność prowadzić. Ja się nazywam Piotr Buras, jestem właśnie dyrektorem tego biura. Tytuł naszej debaty to: czy Unia powinna zmienić swoje podejście do Rosji? I za chwilę powiem kilka słów wprowadzenia na ten temat, ale zanim to zrobię, chciałbym bardzo serdecznie powitać naszych znakomitych panelistów. Jest z nami Pierre Vimont, doradca prezydenta Emmanuela Macrona do spraw Rosji, senior fellow w Carnegie Europe, były ambasador Francji w Stanach Zjednoczonych i dyplomata o ogromnym stażu, który pełnił jeszcze wiele innych ważnych funkcji, których nie będę już wymieniać. Witam bardzo serdecznie. Jest z nami również Marek Menkiszak, szef działu rosyjskiego Ośrodka Studiów Wschodnich, znany w Polsce wszystkim specjalista od Rosji. Jest z nami również Kadri Liik, nie mniej znana specjalistą, nie tylko specjalistą od Rosji, ekspertka, moja koleżanka z European Council on Foreign Relations. Takim pretekstem do tego dzisiejszego spotkania i dyskusji o Rosji z perspektywy Unii Europejskiej był szczyt Unii Europejskiej, który jutro się rozpoczyna i na którym to szczycie przewidziana była dyskusja właśnie na temat polityki Unii Europejskiej wobec Rosji. Chcieliśmy przed tym szczytem trochę zastanowić się, w którym kierunku ta dyskusja może pójść, czego można oczekiwać od tego szczytu, ale okazało się, że tej dyskusji jednak jutro nie będzie. Ten punkt został skreślony z porządku obrad. Zamiast tego przywódcy Unii Europejskiej, przywódcy państw i rządów krajów członkowskich rozmawiać będą na wideokonferencji z Joe Bidenem. Myślę, że to nie jest mniej istotny punkt programu, ale oczywiście, tak jak powiedziałem, ten szczyt Unii Europejskiej, ta zapowiedziana wcześniej debata o Rosji, to był tylko pretekst do rozmowy na ten temat, ponieważ powodów prawdziwych jest znacznie więcej. Mamy dzisiaj od już dłuższego czasu trwającą dyskusję w Unii Europejskiej na temat tego, czy ustalona kilka lat temu po agresji Rosji przeciwko Ukrainie i po aneksji Krymu linia Unii Europejskiej wobec Rosji jest adekwatna i to pytanie bardzo silnie wybrzmiewa dzisiaj w debacie europejskiej. Przypomnijmy, że ta linia opiera się, oprócz utrzymywanych od lat już sankcji,
EU, apart from sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, is based on
z których myślę najważniejszy jest ten, że rozwiązanie kryzysu w Donbasie na podstawie tak zwanych porozumień mińskich jest warunkiem intensyfikacji relacji między Rosją a Unią, czy jej zasadniczej zmiany, jak to jest zmiany w tych relacjach, czy jakiegoś większego zbliżenia czy współpracy. To jest pierwszy punkt. Pozostałe to jest takie, że Unia Europejska ma wzmacniać swoją odporność na zagrożenia ze strony Rosji, na przykład w wymiarze bezpieczeństwa cybernetycznego czy energetycznego. Trzeci punkt, że Unia ma rozbudowywać i zacieśniać relacje z krajami Partnerstwa Wschodniego, czyli wschodnimi sąsiadami Unii Europejskiej. Czwarty, że możliwe jest selektywne zaangażowanie w relacje z Rosją w obszarach, gdzie Unia ma w tym swój interes. I piąty punkt, że należy rozbudowywać relacje między społeczeństwami, relacje międzyludzkie na linii Unia Europejska-Rosja. I ta dyskusja o tym, czy ten model relacji, czy ten model polityki może raczej Unii Europejskiej wobec Rosji jest powinien nadal być stosowany, czy on jest adekwatny do dzisiejszej sytuacji, ona jest z różnych stron prowadzona, z różnych stron prowokowana. O konieczności takiej rewizji tego podejścia i konieczności prób naprawy relacji z Moskwą i zmiany podejścia od co najmniej 2 lat mówi prezydent Francji Emmanuel Macron, który zwraca między innymi uwagę na to, że wprowadzone przez Unię sankcje nie wpłynęły w gruncie rzeczy w żaden sposób na zmianę polityki rosyjskiej wobec swojego sąsiedztwa, wobec Unii Europejskiej. Prezydent Macron sam podjął szereg prób, żeby jakoś te relacje ożywić, spotykając się i telefonując z Władimirem Putinem wielokrotnie i sądując możliwości odbudowy tych stosunków. Mamy również w ostatnich, przypominając wydarzenia bardzo szeroko komentowane, mieliśmy sprawę próby otrucia, potem uwięzienia Aleksieja Nawalnego. To doprowadziło do nowej eskalacji w relacjach Unii Europejskiej z Moskwą, nowych sankcji personalnych, ale też dyskusji o być może potrzebie jednak bardziej zdecydowanej odpowiedzi na to, jak Rosja postępuje i jak gwałci też porozumienia międzynarodowe i standardy w relacjach międzynarodowych. W ostatnią fazę wkracza także budowa gazociągu Nord Stream 2.
Nord Stream 2 pipeline is...
Jak nic innego kładzie się cieniem na wspólnym podejściu Unii do Rosji. Mamy nową administrację w Waszyngtonie, która też w nowym świetle stawia możliwości współpracy między Stanami Zjednoczonymi a Unią Europejską, także w odniesieniu do Rosji. I wreszcie w instytucjach unijnych, a konkretnie w Europejskiej Służbie Działań Zewnętrznych, tej dyplomacji unijnej, trwa przegląd polityki wobec Rosji pod kierownictwem Josepa Borrella, wysokiego przedstawiciela Unii Europejskiej do spraw polityki zagranicznej, i którego niedawna wizyta, nieudana wizyta w Moskwie stała się kolejnym asumptem do dyskusji nad adekwatnością aktualnego podejścia Unii do Rosji. I o tych sprawach, co z tego wszystkiego wynika, chcielibyśmy dyskutować w tym znakomitym gronie. I zanim przyjrzymy się trochę bliżej tej aktualnej strategii Unii Europejskiej wobec Rosji i ewentualnej potrzebie jej zmiany, chciałbym, byśmy przez chwilę zastanowili się razem z naszymi panelistami nad tym, jaki powinien być poziom ambicji i oczekiwań wobec naszych relacji z Rosją, a także co się z tym wiąże, jaki jest stosunek potencjałów obu stron oraz rosyjska perspektywa na Unię. I zacznę od pytania skierowanego do Pierre'a Vimont, który reprezentuje prezydenta Francji, czyli jak już mówiłem, polityka, który w ostatnim czasie najwięcej mówi o konieczności poprawy relacji z Moskwą, czy też ponownego zaangażowania, re-engagement w relacjach z Rosją. I moje pytanie do pana może wydawać się z pozoru banalne, ale wydaje mi się, że chyba jednak od niego trzeba zacząć. Po co Unia Europejska potrzebuje dzisiaj lepszych relacji z Rosją i co za sprawą tego zaangażowania większego z Rosją powinniśmy chcieć osiągnąć? Czy dzisiaj potrzebujemy Rosji bardziej, czy mniej niż powiedzmy 10 czy 15 lat temu, biorąc pod uwagę na przykład zmiany geopolityczne, jakie w ostatnim czasie się pojawiły, konfrontacje Stanów Zjednoczonych z Chinami i inne wydarzenia? Bardzo proszę, Monsieur Vimont.
Thank you, Piotr.
Dziękuję, Piotrze. Dziękuję za zaproszenie. To zawsze ogromna przyjemność brać udział w panelu organizowanym przez Europejską.
Even if I'm in another one, I still think it's quite interesting to be able to discuss a very important topic, no doubt about it. Congratulations also for the very timely event, because it is taking place somewhat squeezed between the Foreign Affairs Ministers' Council, which discussed Russia also, and the European Council, which will discuss, I think, the same item on Friday. So that is really a good opportunity for all of us together to try to think a little bit more about this issue. The question you ask, and I'll try to answer as straightforwardly as I can, being a diplomat, but still I think it's important to speak openly about this issue. It's, in my opinion, it's it's more about not the need to have a stronger relationship with Russia, but the need for the European Union to face the strategic reality we're in today. It's not about revising the policy that the European Union has had with Russia now for a few years. It's about upgrading it. I hear a lot of criticism towards Macron's initiative as being once again an attempt to reset relationship with Russia, and that reset has failed in the past and it will fail again, so on and so forth. I think Macron's position is quite different. It is about, if Europe is really honest about being a geopolitical actor, about wanting to be a global player in the world of today, then it has to have a straightforward geopolitical vision of where it wants to go. And in that vision, Russia has to find its place, just as our other the other global players in the world, be it the United States, of course, be it China, being some of the main regional actors like Turkey, Iran, or others. We need to face the reality that Russia is in our neighborhood, that every time we are facing an issue in our Eastern Partnership, but also in our southern neighborhood around the Mediterranean region, we quite often face Russia there. It's obvious in Ukraine, it's obvious in Georgia, we've just seen it around the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we're witnessing it in Syria or in Libya or elsewhere, and therefore for the Europeans, there is a need to face up to that reality and to face up to that challenge and to think about how to respond, how to be in a stronger position. What we have seen with, I think, Josep Borrell's visit is that for Russia, the EU as such is not considered as a relevant partner. Let's put it that way. And I think this forces us to think about a little bit more about how to be seen and to be perceived in the future in Moscow as a relevant player. And therefore, what Macron is saying, that apart from what we can do in the bilateral field, because there was a need to upgrade our relationship with Russia, surprisingly, and that was one of the things I personally discovered, is that for the last 4 or 5 years, France have a very low profile relationship with Russia. Not many ministerial meetings, no real strategic discussion with Russia for the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, the mandate of the previous president of France, François Hollande, had been 5 years where our partnership, our relationships with Russia had reduced to a very low level. So there was a need, a bilateral need on behalf of France to try to relaunch some sort of bilateral relationship with Russia. But Macron wants to go much ambitiously than that, and he wants to convince his European partners that Europe as such should do more. And that's the whole point. And that's why we have been discussing that for some time. Even before Josep Borrell's visit, the External Action Service had put on the table different ideas about how to re-engage, how to have some selective engagement with Russia. We hadn't gone very far. The visit that Josep Borrell did to Moscow has to some extent forces us to rethink about all this again. And this is what Europeans are going to do, European leaders are going to do next week. But to answer in a nutshell, we need to face reality. This is my point about Russia. And if we want to upgrade our act, we need to think more in our relation with Russia in strategic terms, more than we have done up to now. Sanctions may work to some extent. I agree with that. But it doesn't give you a geopolitical roadmap. You need more than that. To have a real policy, you need more than the 5 guidelines. And that's the French point. I'll stop there, Piotr, for the moment.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo. Marku, ambasador Vimont mówił o tym, że potrzebujemy bardziej geopolitycznego podejścia do Rosji i Rosja jest ważnym partnerem na horyzoncie polityki zagranicznej Unii Europejskiej. I my zaraz przejdziemy do tego, żeby podyskutować trochę bardziej dokładnie, na czym takie podejście mogłoby polegać, ale chciałbym Cię na wstępie zapytać o to, czy w relacjach między Rosją a Unią Europejską
do you think that we are equal partners, Russia and the European Union?
Zasadniczo asymetrię i jak zmienia się ten stosunek sił między obu partnerami w ostatnich latach i jaka jest dominująca tendencja? Gdybyś mógł parę słów na ten temat powiedzieć.
Dziękuję bardzo. Piotrze, pozwól, że będę po angielsku odpowiadać, żeby też być dla moich interlokutorów szanownych bezpośrednio od razu rozumianym. When we see the relationship between the EU and Russia, we could see obviously there is interdependence. That's often used term, interdependence between the two. The question is, however, that this interdependence is clearly asymmetric. And there is only one element in which Russia has advantage over the EU in terms of power relationship. That's the military potential. Of course, if we assume the bigger picture, I mean, the European NATO part, of course, is more balanced, but regionally, of course, Russia is absolutely dominant, regionally dominant power in terms of military. But if we look at the very fundamental economic potential and relationship, we can easily discover that this is very asymmetric for the EU benefit, for the EU advantage. So basically, we can compare just basic numbers. For Russia, EU now after Brexit, it's 38.5% of trade turnover. With UK, it would be 44%. It used to be more. It used to be around 50, but the trend is downward. Basically, the influence here is with the commodity trade, because Russia exports, 3/4 of the Russian exports to the EU is raw material, mainly oil and gas. But for the EU, Russia is below 6% of the trade turnover. So it's 7-fold difference. In terms of energy relationship, which is very crucial, to put it roughly, Russia is twice as much dependent on the European market than Europe is dependent on Russia. When we look at the numbers of the oil exports, Russia's oil exports to the EU is about 54% of total. Gas exports, it's 67%. But if we take pipeline gas, it's 78% of Russia's exports goes to the EU. For the EU, oil imports from Russia is about 1/4 of total. And in terms of gas, it's about 38% of total. And if we look at the FDI, foreign direct investment, 75% of Russia's foreign direct investments in Russia from abroad is from the European Union member states, while only 1% of EU's external foreign direct investment is from Russia. So there is a huge discrepancy. And the major problem, I think, here is that fully in agreement with Ambassador Vimont, is that despite of this big asymmetry, European Union does not consider itself and does not behave as if it would be realize this kind of asymmetric relationship. So put it bluntly, while Russia is far more dependent on the EU than the EU is dependent on Russia, EU tends to behave like this was the opposite situation. And that's my biggest problem with the EU, overall EU policies in which we, I suppose, we will discuss further.
Dziękuję, Marku, i trochę nawiązując do tego, co powiedziałeś o tej asymetrii, która jest w gruncie rzeczy na korzyść Unii Europejskiej, ale Unia Europejska nie potrafi z tego skorzystać, czy nie jest gotowa z tego skorzystać. Pytanie do Kadri o to, jak ostatecznie Rosja postrzega tę asymetrię, czy wyciąga z tego jakieś wnioski, a jeżeli wyciąga, to jakie? Kadri od lat bardzo mocno śledzi dyskurs rosyjski o polityce zagranicznej i analizuje sposób myślenia tamtejszych elit. I chciałem cię zapytać właśnie o to, jakie są dzisiaj twoim zdaniem główne cele i oczekiwania Rosji wobec Unii? Czy Unia dostrzega tę asymetrię, czy dostrzega raczej słabość Unii, właśnie tą, o której mówił Marek?
Dziękuję. Thank you, Piotr. Thank you for inviting me. My pleasure. When it comes to Russia's policy towards the European Union, I think Russia is adopting a wait-and-see position. I would say they do not have policy at the moment, and that's true not only of the European Union, but even of the wider world. Because paradoxically, Russia right now seems to be the victim of a situation where it has seen its wishes fulfilled. For 2 decades, even more, Russia has been calling for a multipolar world, which for them meant bigger role for Russia and less American hegemony. But now, when actually they thought they had got it at the time of the Trump presidency, they suddenly didn't know what to do with it, because as someone in Moscow put it to me, for Primakov, multipolar world was one thing. That was sort of erosion of American hegemony. For Putin, multipolar world is a big mess. It's a chaos where it's hard to set your goals, especially big strategic goals. In that sense, I think the whole current era, it's easier for smaller countries. It's easier for Estonia to decide what it needs to do because its room for maneuver is small anyway. But if you look at great powers, I think it's far harder for them. United States already under Obama didn't quite understand where it should go. And Russia is victim of the same phenomenon. As someone told me, I think it was Fyodor Lukyanov who wrote in one of his interviews, but Russia knew how to set its goals in the world that was ruled by American hegemony. In the world that is in flux, we don't know it. And that has led to discussion about self-isolationism. Let's take a break. Let's not invest in any long-term relationships because we don't know who the players of the future are going to be, what their respective positions are, and what should we make of it. And that is, of course, especially true of European Union because Russia, and probably quite correctly, they see that the fate of the European Union as a geopolitical actor is very much linked to a future world order and the values that inform it. In a way, for European Union, it's much harder to adapt to any changes to a world order than for nation states, because Europe has come together based on rules, norms, and principles. And to adapt to a world where Greece are losing prominence is hard for us. I think we will make it in the end, but Russians are not so sure. And add to it the background. Russia doesn't, I think Russian foreign policy mainstream has never understood the European Union very well. There is a handful of people who understand it as well as any of us, but they are a minority. The sort of rough mainstream has never understood it properly. And they have always exaggerated or misunderstood, for instance, the nature of a transatlantic relationship. They tend to see Europe as America's lapdog, and proof of the opposite would be Europe turning against America and siding with Russia. They have always exaggerated the importance of economic relations. And yet again, the thinking often tends to be that when Europe becomes independent, then it will be guided by its economic interests and ally itself with Russia as opposed to America, which, I don't think will happen, even if we achieve maximum versions of strategic autonomy, that some people think that'll look different. It will not look like that. And of course, Russians, they tend to take a temporary trend and extrapolate it into something much more long-term. That's why ever since the Brexit vote, they have been asking if the EU is there to stay at all. And it takes sort of high-ranking diplomats to try to explain that, listen, guys, EU will not collapse overnight. It has been built for several decades. It won't disappear simply so. But anyway, so I would say that they have taken a pause, and they don't really invest in relationship with the European Union. They do invest a little bit into relationship with member states. And of course, they prioritize member states over the EU. But even that, I would say, is not nearly as ambitious as it was a decade or 12 years ago. You remember the days when we had Schroeder, Chirac, Berlusconi, and their relationship with Vladimir Putin and the plans they made. That was a different world compared to today. And I think the reception Macron initiatives have got in Russia is a clear proof of it. Russians engage with some of it. Yes, bilateral issues, they are probably happy to talk. Some military, some arms control things, but they shun the offer to discuss the European geopolitical order, which I find totally paradoxical, given that for 3 decades, that has been the thing Russia has wanted to discuss with the West. That has been their demand all over and over again. And now suddenly when they are offered exactly that, they don't pick up the phone. And I think it is because they don't think that this can be discussed with Macron.
Nie chcą rozmawiać o Francji, o Macronie, o Unii Europejskiej. Może chcą rozmawiać o tym z USA? Ale ten czas Trumpa, no to...
I'd say in the West that Trump was good for Russia. I think it was, for many in Russia, especially Russian diplomats, it was horrible. And so they are not ready for these big discussions. And then, of course, add to that the domestic sensitivities. Regime is eroding, it's more fragile, and it views the West as a threat. And I think they also now misread us quite widely. There is a discrepancy. For them, liberal international order is over. It's a thing of the past, and they think the world has changed. It will not return. But they do fear that now, with Biden elected in the United States and Europe and the United States sort of reunited again in their strategic outlook, that the West will try to come back to 1990s, to impose the approach and vision of the 1990s. And this is something that people in Moscow think is utterly unrealistic, and they try to fight. And as I said, I don't think that is our policy. I think that is what they read into us. I think that's why Borrell got the treatment in Moscow that he got, because Russians thought that he was a Westerner coming to lecture them on how they need to behave, which wasn't his aim. And that's also, I think, the reaction to Biden's recent remarks. There's, Biden, yeah, he was asked a question about if Putin is killer. He gave very cryptic answer and then rushed to explain why he is talking to Russia. So, he tried to focus on other things, but Russians thought that he was sort of positioning himself against Russia. So to sum it up, I think right now Russia is simply not ready to think strategically about its relationship with the EU, and neither is the EU ready. I won't go into the reasons for that. We can discuss it later. But basically, my view is that calm down, accept facts of life. One fact is that we won't reach a new strategy right now, and this is fine. We will reach it eventually. We should work on it, but in no hurry.
Thank you, Kadri. Dziękuję Kadri bardzo. Zaraz oczywiście przejdziemy i do kwestii Bidena i relacji transatlantyckich w kontekście Rosji, ale chciałbym teraz zapytać pana ambasadora Vimonta o to, o czym już zaczął mówić w swojej pierwszej wypowiedzi, to znaczy powiedział pan, że powinniśmy wyjść trochę poza te 5 zasad, o których mówiłem wcześniej. I chciałbym się na tym krótko zatrzymać, ponieważ wydaje mi się to istotne. To obecne podejście do Unii Europejskiej, do Rosji opiera się, jak ja wspomniałem na początku, na tym założeniu, że zasadnicza zmiana w tych relacjach możliwa będzie dopiero wtedy, kiedy zrealizowane zostaną porozumienia mińskie, to znaczy te wyznaczające drogę rozwiązania konfliktu rosyjsko-ukraińskiego, i one wymagają na określonych warunkach na przykład wycofania się Rosji z okupowanych terytoriów Ukrainy. Dzisiaj oczywiście wiemy, że ten cel jest najprawdopodobniej tak odległy, jak był 5 lat temu. I oczywiście pytanie, czy uzależnianie całokształtu stosunków z Rosji od tak nierealistycznego celu jest słuszne, czy jest może błędem i ogranicza możliwości działania Unii? Czy to tak należy rozumieć pańską sugestię, żeby wyjść poza te 5 zasad i te ramy, na które Unia się kilka lat temu zgodziła?
Let me be clear about that, Piotr. I'm not saying that we should get rid of the 5 principles. On the contrary, I think we should keep them, and we should abide by them and reaffirm those 5 principles. You were talking about, you were mentioning Ukraine. No doubt about it. We need to stick to our line and to our position with regard to Ukraine. We may need patience, but we need to be clear-sighted and well-focused and go along. Among the 5 principles, you have also the principle of resilience, the ability for European Union to protect itself against cyber attack or other types of attacks. And mind you, what has happened a few years ago in Salisbury, what has happened with the poisoning of Navalny is something I think that is important, because it's the use of chemical weapons in Europe. And therefore, here again, it is a matter of abiding by the principles of the rule of law and the principles of international conventions we have adopted. So on all these points, and I could go on, reaching out to civil society, the 5 principles, we can go along with that. But coming back to the point that Marek was making a few minutes ago, and with which I thoroughly agree, the asymmetry that exists at the moment to the benefit of the European Union. How to take stock of that benefit? It's about being more self-assertive and having a European Union that goes a little bit further down the road than what it has been doing up to now. The European Union is mostly used to being in a comfortable position of cooperation with everyone, good friend of all nations and working well with all of them. The European Union doesn't have in its DNA the idea of being confronted with one of the countries it is facing. Remember the way everybody reacted to the 2019 communication on China, where Europe for the first time they're talking about systemic rivalry, and everybody was surprised. It is this kind of how could I put it, of living up to reality once again that I think is necessary with Russia. And therefore, I'm not thinking about revising the 5 principle. I'm thinking about adding to that a more geopolitical vision, as I was saying a few minutes ago, a more strategic mindset about where Europe wants to go. After all, and I wouldn't go too much into this because I don't think we have enough time, but looking at our Eastern Partnership, to have a more geopolitical mind about how to move further on with our partners of the Eastern Partnership, because otherwise we're all the time on the defensive and being surprised at what is going on. And we need to be much more in the forefront of our foreign policy, more active, more agile, more effective and efficient. And this is what I'm talking about at the moment. So it's not about, you know, dropping everything we have done up to now, even about the sanctions. Macron doesn't think that the sanctions are ineffective. He thinks that we do need to do more than that. In fact, nobody knows exactly how efficient sanctions are in general. Sanctions policy is one of the many issues related to the diplomatic trade, where everyone has its own opinion about the efficiency of sanctions, and nobody has the real answer because nobody knows exactly. We can go on saying that our sanctions in Ukraine have worked because it have prevented Russia from moving too deeply into Ukraine. We don't know in reality, but sanctions are there. And I think the important point with regard to Moscow is that sanctions have held since 2014. Europeans have remained united around the package of sanctions that they have taken concerning Ukraine. And I think that has been an important message that was sent to Russia, and that this is the kind of message I'm looking more and more for, to show a European Union more assertive, more self-confident in its way forward. And in order to do that, we need to have a more geostrategic mind than we have had up to now. And that's my point. I'll stop there, Piotr.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie ambasadorze. Ja tak przysłuchując się państwa wypowiedziom, mam takie wrażenie, że czy pojawia się takie pytanie, to skąd w takim razie w ogóle ten spór w Unii Europejskiej na temat kierunku polityki wobec Rosji? No bo jeżeli Marek Menkiszak mówi, że jest asymetria na korzyść Unii Europejskiej i jest niedobrze, że Unia Europejska nie potrafi tej asymetrii wykorzystać odpowiednio w relacjach z Rosją. Jeżeli pan ambasador Vimont mówi, że potrzebne nam jest właśnie nie porzucenie tych 5 zasad, nie uzależnienie bliskości relacji z Rosją od rozwiązania kryzysu czy konfliktu ukraińskiego i że potrzebne jest takie bardziej geopolityczne myślenie, więcej strategicznego podejścia do relacji z Rosją, to właściwie można by pomyśleć, że się wszyscy zgadzamy, a jednocześnie mam wrażenie, że jest bardzo poważny rozziew, przynajmniej na poziomie politycznym, pomiędzy, no mówiąc już wprost, krajami takimi jak Francja z jednej strony, a krajami jak Polska czy Litwa z drugiej strony. Czy to nie jest trochę tak, że zgadzamy się co do tej asymetrii, zgadzamy się do tego, że Unia powinna być aktorem bardziej zdecydowanym w relacjach z Rosją i mającym swoje stanowisko, ale nie zgadzamy się trochę co do wiary w to, że Unię w ogóle na to stać. To znaczy, to jest pytanie do Marka, czy to nie jest tak, że tutaj w naszym regionie też jest bardzo poważna obawa, że no jednak Unia jako całość, a nie poszczególne kraje członkowskie nie jest w stanie wykorzystać tej asymetrii na swoją korzyść i nie jest w stanie prezentować takie stanowisko, jakie mówił pan ambasador Vimont, i że próby wypracowania go, czy próby podejmowane zwłaszcza że przez poszczególne kraje w tym kierunku no raczej nie służą Unii Europejskiej, właściwie raczej ją osłabiają niż wzmacniają. Marku, jak ty to widzisz? Jak widzisz ten sedno tego sporu, który wydaje mi się jednak jest dosyć oczywisty?
Thank you, Pierre. Let me slightly broaden your question in my answer. And of course, it's difficult to disagree with Mr. Ambassador about the general assessment that the problem is how to define the particular responses. And I think that's the issue for discussion. And I would like to make a couple of basic points on that. The first point is that I strongly believe that the old German formula of Wandel durch Handel, change to trade, doesn't work with Russia. And no EU's and no member states' previous engagement visibly influenced Russia's aggressive policies towards the EU. And the same is true about the major infrastructure energy projects. The second point is that the main source of a problem is Russia's internal politics, because at the core of it is the authoritarian system of Russia, which is morphing under Putin's rule into dictatorship with elements of a totalitarian state. There is increasing paranoia of Russia's leadership, which is perceives being at war with the West, the war led by the United States, which leads to aggressive Moscow policies. And the response is that no policy of taking Russia as it is can help. Only the substantial regime change in Russia may bring change in Russia's policies and the relationships, including with the EU. And I believe the EU's strategic interest is to stand by the Russian civil society and indirectly, I underline, foster such change. The third point is that political dialogue with Russia is necessary, but mainly to keep lines of communication open, deliver messages, receiving signals, but it should have limits. Especially one should avoid give the Kremlin PR successes, which are used to boost political legitimacy while undermining EU's credibility, including among the pro-European part of the Russian society. The fourth point is that we should not focus on selective engagement, but enhance in parallel all 5 points in relationship. So I mean the partners, states and the member states' resilience, deterrence versus Russia, and support for Russia's civil society. And I believe we should create almost automatic mechanism of reaction of Russia's aggressive moves through sanctions, which may be previously communicated to Moscow in form of warnings. Another point is that we should engage in dialogue and possible limited conditional cooperation on individual issues, which are beneficial for the EU. but we should not have inflated expectations, as potential of such issues like climate change, Arctics, regional conflicts, arms control, fight with terrorism are often overestimated. And what is very important is to avoid compartmentalization. So we should not allow cooperation a la carte done by Moscow. We should create linkages and we should create conditionalities. Also, while thinking about geopolitical broader environment, we should avoid dubious political cliches. One of the most popular cliche is, let's not push Russia into China's arms. This is based on false assessment of Russia's policies. EU, the West in general, never pushed Russia out of Europe. It was Russia's leadership who has been doing that for many years. Russia's-China's axis hasn't started in 2014. It evolved for decades. And Russia can't be flipped on China because Moscow-Beijing bond is very strong on a basis of authoritarianism, anti-liberalism, and anti-Westernism. And the last point, we should change our paradigm of thinking and instead asking questions, what do we have done wrong on Russia? And what incentives we can offer to Moscow for changing policies? We should show strategic patience, possibly perform some strategic pause, and let Moscow feel and reflect how important is the EU, waiting for Russia to deliver offers for the EU.
Dziękuję, Marku. Ja myślę, że to był bardzo ciekawe expose pewnego podejścia do Rosji, które sugeruje, że na pewno pan ambasador Vimont, a na pewno również Kadri będą mieli komentarz do tego. Ja bym zachęcał wszystkich uczestników, naszych słuchaczy, widzów do zadawania pytań, wykorzystując tę funkcję czat na Zoomie. Bardzo bym prosił o pisanie pytań właśnie w czacie. Natomiast chciałbym zapytać Kadri, ponieważ Marek powiedział coś bardzo, wydaje mi się, istotnego i ważnego, to znaczy, że nie powinniśmy po prostu brać Rosji taką, jaka jest, czy akceptować Rosji taką, jaka jest i ustawiać naszą politykę pod tym kątem. Ja zastanawiam się, czy to jest podejście zgodne z tym, co ty wcześniej mówiłaś o takiej strategicznej cierpliwości, którą powinniśmy mieć wobec Rosji. To znaczy, ja zrozumiałem twoje słowa trochę, że w zasadzie to podejście, które mamy teraz, nie jest złe. To znaczy, że właściwie nie jesteśmy w stanie dużo więcej zrobić i być może dużo więcej nie jest w tej chwili potrzebne, że z taką Rosją, jaka jest, no trzeba zaakceptować właśnie, że ona jest, jaka jest, dużo więcej się zrobić nie da i trzeba to trochę przeczekać. Na pewno wyostrzam twój pogląd, ale ciekaw jestem twojej opinii, zwłaszcza jeśli chodzi o ten punkt Marka komentarza.
Yes, I'm afraid I am a bit skeptical about the perspectives for us to change Russia. I don't see any straightforward way for that. I think our best means to change Russia is to make liberal democracy properly work in our own countries, because Russians follow us very diligently. And they understand when we behave as we preach, and they see when we do not. And they are happy to call our bluff when we do not. And so I think if they saw that these things that we keep talking about work in our own societies, and we are not hypocritical, but we really mean it, then that would have some impact on their thinking at home as well. But as to us trying to micromanage Russia or foster change, in using more direct means, I am skeptical, because what I see very significant disillusionment with the West in Russia, also among the people who are actually sort of pro-rule of law and pro-democracy in Russian conditions, but they don't see the West as a role model because they think that often we are hypocritical and we have got many things wrong also in foreign policy. And likewise, I think any pressure to Russia in this regard would actually enhance the likelihood that the Kremlin uses it to create the besieged fortress situation, which they are trying to do anyway. And, you know, my observation actually was a paradoxical one, that it was after Trump election that protests became more prominent in Russia, and that there started some discussion also among the elites about the improvement of relations with the West. You see, the sort of existential threat was removed in their mind with Trump election. They didn't feel that the West was out attacking Russia, and that actually relaxed them so much that some processes that I view as positive could be launched in Russia. And that also applies to sanctions. My best proof that sanctions work was from that time, when I saw certain intrasystemic people arguing for improvement of relations with the West, so that sanctions could be removed, that Russia's economy could grow more smartly. They didn't prevail in the end, but the mere fact that such discussion happened at all, and that these people accepted Russia's responsibility. I mean, Alexei Kudrin was on the record with it, saying that we need to improve relations with the West, and for that Russia needs to do things as well, not just expect the West to come forward towards us. I think that was significant. So sometimes it's best to leave Russia to its own devices, even in the past. I remember I was in Moscow in the 1990s, and then macroeconomic issues were the big deal. Russia applied for another IMF loan every other week, and they never managed to balance the budget. They needed more and more money. And the moment they had defaulted and everyone had sort of given up on micromanaging Russia's economy, Bill Clinton didn't ask Yeltsin anymore to keep Chubais on his job, then it was actually the essentially communist government headed by Yevgeny Primakov who composed Russia's first balanced budget. You know, that's slightly arbitrary example from another era and another sphere, but occasionally that works. You know, Russia is Russia's responsibility, not ours. But I think we can give some indications in our attitude, that we can communicate it to Russia that, okay, it's your choice whether you want to be democracy, autocracy, totalitarian country. We cannot really help it. We have our preferences. We have made it clear, and that your relationship with us will be tailored accordingly. We were hoping that you would become a like-minded democracy, hence the ambitious agenda of the 1990s strategic partnership that was later downgraded to modernization partnership and all these things. But if that's not your goal, if that's not your vision, then we will take a different approach as well. And I think the European Union is actually very good at communicating these sorts of stances and attitudes, and that's what we should do, as opposed to trying to arrange regime change in Russia, where we don't have very good track record anyway.
Thank you, Kadri. Before I give the floor to Mr. Vimont, Marek wanted to quickly respond to your response to his points, but please, Marek, take just 2 minutes, because Mr. Vimont needs to leave us 12, and I would like to give him a chance to respond to the questions also from the chat.
Absolutely, Piotr. I wanted only to make myself clear So I'm not advocating about changing Russia, about creating a regime change in Russia. That's not what I said. My point is that we should focus more on the Russian civil society and on EU's credibility towards the Russian civil society. So the worst thing the EU can do to the Russian civil society is the view of lines of European politicians and businessmen waiting in corridors in the Kremlin to make deals with Mr. Putin and deliver to him easy PR successes. That is the worst thing what we can do for Russia, for future of Russia. It is only Russians who can change Russia. We can't. But I think what we should do is to make clear our principles, our interests, and make our policies in agreement with those principles and interests, not creating the image, which is sometimes rightly poked on us as hypocritical or making a smoke screens when we speak about basic rights. And I do not believe that we can help mythical liberals among the Russian government. They have totally sidelined, and this system cannot reform. This system can only fall. I think we should not help it to stay.
Thank you, Marek. And now, Mr. Vimont, there are a number of questions. I'm sure you would like to react also, and it would be great if you could react on Marek's intervention. But there are also at least three questions in the chat. The one from Susan Stewart, what would having a more geopolitical approach to the Eastern Partnership countries mean? Then from Yang Yu, don't you think that geopolitical approach to the role of Russia may lead to the situation that interests of France and Germany are not identical with interests of Poland and the Baltic countries? And James Nixie asks for clarification what you precisely meant saying that the EU has to be more strategic or geostrategic about how it approaches Russia. So, Mr. Vimont, the floor is yours.
O tym, że podejście Unii.
Many good questions and difficult questions indeed, but very interesting one. Piotr, let me start by just saying one word about what Marek was saying, and I may agree or disagree with some of the different points he made about the need to wait for a change in Russia, about compartmentalization, etc., etc. But my only concern with what he is saying is the one I was mentioning right at the beginning. Namely, if we follow the 6 or 7 points that Marek has made, what we are ending with is a sort of status quo, is a sort of standstill, foreign policy. There is nothing we can gain from trying to find the proper way to discuss with Russia, so let's wait and see. And this is where I think personally we would be in a difficult position. Because events go on, Russia will move on, and as we go along, we will never be able to anticipate events, and we will always be dragged into crisis more than we are able to manage them. And I think that's really the issue I'm trying to put forward from the beginning. We have to be more proactive if we want to be on top of events as they unfold, which hasn't been the case in the last few years. And a lot has to do, of course, with the positions taken by Russia. I can agree on that, but it also has to do with the fact that Europe has never lived up to its ambitions all too often. And that's the point I think we're facing today. Let me give you a very topical issue at the moment with regard to the political confrontation in Georgia between the government and the opposition. Europe steps in through the president of the European Council, Charles Michel, and proposed to be a sort of honest broker. I don't think it's a bad idea. I think it's taking the lead here is a bold move, a risky one, but it's worth trying. But then Europe has to be steadfast and must have strong resolution in moving ahead and doing a really effective and active mediation. Otherwise, it's not worth trying to step in. That's what I mean by being a geopolitical actor, is by understanding the situation, the political environment, and moving in, knowing exactly where your interests are, what the goals you want to pursue. And I think that is what is important. You need to have a long game perspective. You need to have a vision for the long term of what you want to do. This is what I mean when I'm talking about being a more geopolitical actor. One of the, in my opinion, one of the difficulties that the European Union is facing today in its policy towards Russia is that the Europeans don't have a clear idea about what are their interests, what are the long-term objectives they want to pursue. What is it about security and stability in the long term for the European continent? Is it about economic cooperation? Is it about looking at the long-term challenges with regard to new technology, to climate change, or whatever? What are we looking for? And it seems to me that all too often the Europeans, the 27 member states, are not able to have a proper straightforward discussion on these different issues. The question put by one of our audience is a good one. We don't like to engage in those discussions between ourselves because we are divided. And I totally agree. We may not have exactly the same position on many of these issues for obvious reasons and quite natural reasons. Geography, history is not the one. We haven't shared the same history and we don't share the same geography. And I think it is very important not to lecture, but to listen to what Poland, the Baltic states and other countries can say to France, Germany or Spain, which are located in a different part of Europe. I think that's very important. But what Europe has been all about, what our union has been all about, is the possibility of overcoming this division and at the end to be able to come to some common position. The problem we're facing today, if I may, is that all too often with Russia, we're having an emotional discussion. One that is led by whatever you may say, ideological reasons, emotional reasons or others. But the reality is to have a cool-headed, analytical discussion on Russia is becoming very, very difficult. And I think we should start there. When Kadri is saying, let's cool down. I think she's right. My point would be, let's cool down and have really a clear, open discussion. That's important. Where I may disagree is, for me, cool down doesn't mean that we should not be active. We should move and we should take, at the end of the day, some clear-cut decisions about where we want to move along. I think that's very important. Last question I was asked was about Eastern Partnership. Eastern Partnership is, of course, moving every day into a sort of minefield because this part of the European continent is being seen as a sort of territory for the sphere of influence of Russia. We know that. And on the other side, the European Union sees our Eastern partner as natural partner for more cooperation, for closer link, closer association, and from some of the EU member states, even the possibility of membership in the future. So for me, instead of trying to avoid discussing these issues and keeping them somewhere under the carpet because we don't agree, it seems to me that that's the wrong way of doing it. We need to go into an open political discussion, which means at some point, even discussing about our own future as the EU. What I mean about being geopolitical is also having a better understanding about what the European Union means. What are its future borders? What should we say about the future of enlargement? As long as we try to avoid that kind of difficult political discussion, we put ourselves in a weak position. And of course, countries around the world which are looking at us are just trying to take advantage of these weaknesses, of these vulnerabilities. So it's also about discussing these issues that we will be able to be more self-assertive, more self-confidence, because we will know who we are and where we want to go. This is what it's all about at the end of the day. I'll stop there, Piotr.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a question. Can you stay with us for a couple of minutes yet, or you are muted now? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can stay. Sorry, I can stay for a few more minutes, but in 5 minutes I have to go. Sorry.
Yeah. So maybe if you, because we have time until 12:30. So maybe if you could pick up one question more asked by Tony van der Togt. Should the EU not align its Russia policies in certain areas more with the US to have any real impact, and what the areas potentially could be? I think this is the question I wanted to ask you anyway, about the potential of the transatlantic cooperation with Russia. Is the Biden administration really an opportunity, or is this very tough language rather sort of amplifying even the divisions within the European Union?
Listen, on this whole issue about Biden's tough language, I would be cautious, because if you really look at the interview he gave, first of all, he's not the one who came in with the killer concept. It was a question that was put to him, of course. And secondly, if you look at his whole answer, you will see that, as always, there was this dual approach. It was about being firm, but also engaging. And Joe Biden reminded that there has already been an agreement between Moscow and Washington about extending the New START treaty. So that's the way, I would say, diplomacy works. You have to walk on both legs. And this is, I think, what the Biden administration will do. The second observation, naturally, we have to work with our partners and with our allies when discussing what should be an EU-Russian policy. If only because of what Kadri was saying earlier on, if we think a little bit more about the future of EU security policy, and more globally, the European security and stability in the future, we need to work on this very closely with our American partners, because for Russia, America is the obvious partner, and maybe to some extent the only significant, relevant actor and partner in that game. But precisely coming back to what Emmanuel Macron has been saying time and again, we can't allow outside partners or outside country to decide on our behalf about the future of European security. We need at least to have a say. We need to be able to put our points and our side of the argument on the table. and certainly France intends to do that. And you know, we've seen that before. We've seen that in the 1980s when we were going through this missile crisis in 1982-83. And that was the moment when the Europeans had to say their own words, came in. There was even, as you may remember, some popular protest all around Europe about those missiles, those cruise missiles. And therefore, in order to avoid the repetition of those difficult moments, this is where we need to be part of the overall discussion on security and strategic matters between the US and Russia. If we are left aside, if here again we apply the status quo policy, Europe will have no voice, no word to say, and maybe at the end of the day, decisions that will be taken will go against European interest. This is why we need to be very much part of these discussions. At least that's the French point of view. Having said that, I apologize, Piotr, but I think I will have to leave you. Thanks again for a very interesting conversation, and I hope to be back one of these days.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Thank you very much, Mr. Vimont, for joining us. It has been a pleasure and an honor to host you at this event, and good luck with everything. And we will continue our conversation with Kadri and Marek for another 15 minutes. And I would like to encourage all participants in the audience to ask the questions in the chat. And perhaps I would like to move to Kadri. Maybe you have some points you wanted to raise in response to the last intervention by Mr. Vimont, but there is also one very interesting question in the chat by Federica Prandin about climate change as a possible area of engagement with Russia, and this is, of course, it's coming up very often as an idea how we could create a positive agenda in the relationship with Russia. And I think there are two questions which I would like to add up to the one posed by Federica. The one is Russia really interested in this kind of cooperation? And the second, on climate change, on the implications of Green Deal, is it an area where we can have a sort of rational and constructive conversation with Russia? And the second question is, would such a cooperation, if it took place, translate into an improvement of the overall relationship? Is this because I think that the hope is very often that by having more of this, what we call selective engagement in selected areas, cooperation in selected areas, we could move ahead in this relationship in general, we can improve it, we can build confidence, build trust. And is it a realistic goal? So these two questions related to climate change, but perhaps also some other areas, possible areas of engagement with Russia, which would come to your mind. Kadri.
Thank you. Yes, I have some strong feelings in this regard. Starting from engagement as such, I think it's a good idea to engage with Russia every now and then, but I have so little patience for the sort of mechanical and clock-sticking way we sometimes approach it. You know, these discussions among officials that we have done sanctions, now we need to do a little bit of engagement, as if the balance between the two was the goal. It's not. It's stupid. It's like demanding that, you know, we use sunglasses and umbrella in a proportionate way, whereas actually, you know, you should do what you need. If it's umbrella, use umbrella. If sun is shining, you take sunglasses. And likewise with sanctions and engagement, or all five principles, you do what you need to do and what you can do at that moment. Some things you maybe cannot do. Now, I think climate change might be an issue to engage, but yet again, we are going about it in a upside down way. I think the questions need to be posed differently, not, whether climate change should be a good way to engage Russia, but whether we need or not Russia to arrest climate change. And if we do, how to go about it. Arresting climate change is the aim. Russia is means, not vice versa. And when it comes to engaging with Russia and being more geopolitical, I think Russia's approach is really very simple. We have made it difficult for us, discussing endlessly whether we should engage or not, or Russia engages with all players on areas where Russia thinks they are relevant and have leverage, where they can influence something. And that's why, they want to discuss arms control with the United States, but not necessarily with Estonia. That's why they discuss Syria with Turkey and Iran, but not with the EU, because the EU never invested the sort of resources it should have invested to have any chance of making his vision for Syria a realistic policy, and Russia saw it. And that's why they don't really want to discuss that with us. They discuss cross-border management, they discuss with Estonia or Finland, and they don't have, when it comes to that, they don't have that complex that Estonia is so small and so nasty that we should never talk with them at all. No, when there is an issue where Estonia can resolve, where Estonia can deliver, they talk with Estonia. And it is really quite clear and simple. So I think what Ambassador Vimont was saying was that we should build up relevance on more policy issues, and that would also make us relevant vis-a-vis Russia and would increase our leverage. I wholeheartedly agree with it, except that I think, yet again, the logic should be different. We should have relevance on those policy issues because we want and need, not in order to look relevant to Russia, not in order to impress Russia, but because this is part of what we want to do. And, on some issues, we maybe never get there. I think Syria was hopeless to start with. I don't think we were ever ready to invest that much of diplomatic and military resources, lives in Syria, as would have been needed in order to make our vision a reality. So sometimes you just cannot do it. You don't have that sort of political will, consensus in the society, etc. But on other issues you can. And of course, things like climate change or vis-a-vis issues where European Union is relevant, like, where we have impacted Russia most might be its energy policy. Third energy package has transformed the way Gazprom thinks and operates. And climate could be similar. I hear from Moscow how Russian politicians and companies are interested in European Green Deal and the implication that will have on Russia's hydrocarbon exports. They are reaching out to us. They are shunning us and so many other issues, but this one makes them interested. So yeah, I think there is a chance, but yet again, the end goal is doing something about climate, not engaging Russia. And overlapping, I don't know. It's direct overlap the way Germany has been hoping for a long time. I don't think they hope anymore, to be honest. I think they are quite pessimistic and melancholic, but I don't think direct overlap will happen. It's not like you create some positive vibe and everyone finds out that the other one is not so bad. There are structural issues that make it complicated, but in some roundabout ways it could happen, not least by making political discussion a bit more relaxed in Russia, or giving some people among civil society more direct influence, more direct experience of interaction with Europe, and the small effects would be there, but nothing big and direct.
Thank you, Kadri, and I would like to turn back to Marek, and perhaps using your Kadri metaphor of wearing sunglasses or using umbrella, because I think we are perhaps I don't want to read too much into Marek's intervention, but perhaps Marek concentrates very much on the umbrella, right? I mean, that we need to wear the umbrella in the relations with Russia for very good reasons. But the question is, you said, Kadri, that you can wear, basically, this is how I interpret your words, you can wear the sunglasses, meaning you should or you could engage with Russia if you are relevant. And if you are a relevant actor in an area, and perhaps the problem with the Europe's inability to use this asymmetry Marek was talking at the very beginning about in relations with Russia, is that we are theoretically on the stronger side, but we fail to make ourselves relevant in areas which are relevant to Russia. So my question for Marek is: do you see a potential for Europe and a realistic potential in any of the important battlefields of today's international or economic relations for Europe to make itself relevant for Russia, so that we can have a sort of hard-nosed engagement with Russia from the position of strength and not as a demandeur? Marek.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I like that dirty word of geopolitics get into European vocabulary. That's nice. Of course, the problem is how to make policies follow the rhetoric. That's the challenge, as always. And I believe that, and I'm not advocating passivity of the EU policies, but basing also on what you have said, is that not always directly engaging Russia is a way to do policies. Sometimes it's even better to indirectly engage Russia in a sense of being ambitious, also in geopolitical terms, in areas which are considered vital for Russia. And here it comes, the Eastern Partnership. We should be ambitious, absolutely ambitious, on Eastern Partnership countries and on our engagements there. We should add, as an EU, a security element in the Eastern Partnership and EU policies there. We should not constantly ask ourselves questions how it could possibly make Russia react, how it could anger the Russians. Well, if it angers the Russians, that's good. We should base our policies on our interests. And if we would like to be responded by Russia and treated by Russia as important actor, sometimes we have to be ready to challenge Russia wherever and whenever we feel it's in connection with our defined interests. So that is my response. It's not always the way of being ambitious, being geopolitical, and engaging Russia does not always mean make another offer to the Russians. Sometimes it's better to make some effective policy steps, which Russia actually will have to react to. So to change this dynamic, that this is only we who react on Russia's moves. We should make our own moves in the neighborhood and make Russia responding somehow to that. I think that's the way to upgrade also the EU as an actor in Russian policies. However, I do agree with Kadri that it's extremely difficult to overcome certain deeply seated perceptions, because Russia does not recognize EU as a community. It recognizes EU as a concert of powers, with clear hegemons, with Germany as a hegemon, with France attempting to become a vice hegemon. But it's very difficult to overcome it. But there's no other way than to actually do policy actions, including in the surrounding of Russia, but also within the territory of the EU. Clamp down on corruption, more business transparency, taking at assets of the Russian oligarchs and Russian officials on the EU territory, and the closing some loopholes which Russia used for various forms of corruption within the EU.
Dziękuję bardzo, Marku. Dziękuję Kadri. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo za tę świetną, bardzo stymulującą moim zdaniem dyskusję. Ja drogą podsumowania w jednym zdaniu dosłownie powiedziałbym, że wniosek jest trochę taki, że warunkiem do tego, żeby Unia Europejska mogła w sposób konstruktywny ze swojego punktu widzenia, w sposób skuteczny angażować się bardziej w relacje z Rosją, jest to, żeby sama była w kluczowych sprawach aktorem zdecydowanym i mającym znaczenie. I to jest trochę, jeżeli tego nie ma, albo nie ma wiary, że możemy to osiągnąć, to ta blokada, która, czy może nie blokada, może opory, które w Unii Europejskiej przed tym są wśród wielu krajów, jest w jakimś sensie zrozumiała. To znaczy, zanim staniemy się, zanim osiągniemy to, o czym pewnie myśli i prezydent Macron, i dzisiaj mówił pan ambasador Vimont, no jest wiele jeszcze do zrobienia pracy wewnątrz Unii. To znaczy ta praca domowa jest ważna i ona jeszcze na nas czeka. I wydaje mi się, że tutaj pomimo tej naszej dyskusji, pomimo wielu zbieżności, jednak też no, widzieliśmy, jak trudno wypracować jeden język, jedno podejście, które by no, spełniało właśnie te kryteria takiej strategii opartej na Unii Europejskiej, na wizji Unii Europejskiej jako silnego, spójnego i zdecydowanego aktora